Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are today. I want to say thank you. Thank you for joining me in this discussion, focusing on now the 15th chapter of the book, Jesus in Our Days. As I like to always bring to all of us this book, and we're at the closing end, right? We're in the 15th chapter as we come to the almost end of the book. I just wanted to remind everyone that this is the book number one of a series of books called the Psychological Series, written by the spiritual author Joanna de Angelis in collaboration with Divaldo Pereira Franco. This series is both powerful, it is impactful, and I am honored to be here to present some of the ideas found in this book. And the intent of our discussions is just to discuss some of the insights, some of the messages contained in this first book, right? And we review them on a weekly basis. And the book, just a plug, if you are not someone who likes to read, each chapter ranges from 3 to perhaps 4 pages long. But while it brings very interesting and different perspective about Jesus and in his life on earth, those 3 short years that he gave to us while on earth about 2,000 years ago. They really bring a lot of concepts that I like to bring on a weekly basis in about 30 minutes of discussion, right? As we dive to these teachings, I like to say that Joanna de Angelis brings what she calls a notion of a uncrucified Jesus. So I'm here to welcome Jesus in your life and to see how he brought some just amazing lessons and inspirational thought so that we are better equipped to confront the challenges similar to this, right, in our lives. So today we are, as I said before, on the 15th chapter. And I'm really excited because we have a very thick one, if you will, a very dense one. But let's go ahead and get started. We start in what I call a discussion on life, right? Marcia, you mentioned Torment is the title of the book. Yes, Jesus in Torment is the title of the chapter. And with each part, and I'm breaking down into 4 or 5 parts, we're going to discuss first life. So let's just start by saying, what is Joanna de Angelis is talking about here? Torment. And what is even the definition of torment for us to start the discussion? Well, if you go to the dictionary and you can simply Google for it, it's very simple. The definition of torment is something that causes someone, you, me, the experience of severe mental or physical suffering. So, torment, which is something that will lead to suffering. Those are two very important concepts for our discussion today. And I paused to ask myself, well, why is this even important? Am I tormented? Do I suffer? Right? And before we move on to talk about it, I just stopped to say, but what are the mental images that actually come to mind when we think of a type of trigger to severe mental and physical health, right? To me, it's simple. I translate to torture, right? Basically, all those movies that you may see where a spy, very archetypal, almost a type of figure, right? A spy is caught and he or she is tortured to get out of some information that he or she was trained not to give. Torture comes to my mind also maybe during the war, all the stuff that was happening and how they inflicted severe pain, right? Torture in the sense of perhaps the Inquisition, right, where we suffered in the Western Hemisphere, the Christian, mostly in European countries. Suffered through the methods of the Inquisition. Regardless of that, what is important for us to understand is, on one hand, we have advanced so much, right, in life and technology. This is 2023, but we still suffer and we still have some things that push us to become to feel tortured, and we have to further break down, okay, if we suffer, what types of sufferings do we have? And it's simply put a physical suffering or an emotional, mental, spiritual suffering, right? Physical suffering usually we can clearly see in our minds is something that is impacted our physical material lives. Maybe I am going through something, a disease, some condition that is impacting my life. It can be not only that, it could be a, I don't know, a disaster, a catastrophe, a loss of your means of being able to support yourself, your family. It can be anything that is really in the material, physical world. In the emotional, spiritual suffering, which is mostly related to the loss of someone that is so dear to us, or loss of something within us, right? In the mental landscape. But before we keep going, because this is a delicious chapter, if I may say so, I would like to bring, and there's a reason why. I just finished discussing this book not so long ago. So I just wanted to go ahead and bring to you as well some of the lessons from this beautiful book. Well, the book I'm talking about is the book authored by Leon Denis, right? A French author that was first published in French in 1908. Yes, 150 years ago. And the title is Life and Destiny. I think it's actually out of print, the English translations, but it is easily accessible as a PDF. I I have the books both in Portuguese and in English. I was lucky enough, but I believe they're available. Anyways, life and destiny, right? So we're talking about life and we're talking about suffering and we're talking about destiny, all of it as one big discussion. And Leon Denis, he starts his book on the introduction, I think, of his book when he's just talking about life. He talks about the notion of being, uh, and he brings a very interesting problem statement. He says, those are my words, by the way, but roughly he says the inability of human institutions, and by that he talks about specifically educational institutions or religious institutions, right? So the inability of human institutions to clarify what really matters to us, right, is the reason why we go through so much pain. And he's talking here specifically, what are those things that really matter to us? Well, uh, specifically the immortality of our soul, right? And because those institutions are unable, incapable, or unwilling to discuss that, we are left in this state that does not equip us to deal with them better. So it's what am I, right? An immortal soul. What is the nature? What am I in a spiritual dimension, a physical dimension? And why am I here? What is the goal of this life? So that's his book. But interesting enough, he states the modern soul. So yes, it was written over 100 years ago, but he's talking about you and me today, right? The modern soul, we find nothing but unclear, obscure, and often contradictory information whenever we start to talk about the problem of our existence. So he says, because of it, right, we generally speaking, we can attribute the problems of our time on the incoherence of ideas, the disorder of our conscience. And by disorder, we're talking about the lack of an organized, ordered thought process of our conscience, and the moral and social lack of structure or anarchy. He uses the term anarchy. So he concludes with the idea that the lack of perspective regarding our material life, our spiritual life, is this lack of perspective, is the leading cause to the current, then 1900s, and now moral corrosion skepticism. And I say, Leon Denis, you are right on point here, right? So it is according to him that his conclusion is that materialism, meaning institutions, and it can be even your family as an institution, your schools, universities, colleges, or religious, when those institutions focus on the material aspect of life, meaning the temporary, ephemeral things that you focus, but they really mean nothing, right? So that notion of materialism is led to an interesting type of vicious cycle to where we are from a cultural and a perspective of life itself. So he said materialism has caused a dependence on our understanding of what life is. In his words, and I love it, by the way, we have this dependence. And when he says that, I picture like a dependence on a drug or something right out there, an addiction to something. So he said there's a dependence on the idea of chance. How about that? So Leon Denis says chance is the reason behind who we are as a result of a, simply put, a biological and physical chemical combination that is almost like a recipe, a cellular recipe that is life, and that science is there to observe and study. How about that? So, by starting with that dependence on this statement or this viewpoint, everything else follows. So, from that perspective, it is, I really like it, but from that perspective, 115 years after he wrote or published the book, we really can come to terms with the idea that materialism and the correlated lack of knowledge about the mortality of our souls will cause demotivation. It can cause the sense of an emptying of our being, and right, an emptiness, and it results in a sense of a pessimistic outlook of life, or if not a pessimistic, a apathetical, a conformist, a stagnated view of what life is. I'm just here. I have no power. I will just accept and I'll do nothing. So either way, either this very pessimistic that may lead to anger and other types of behaviors, or a very indifferent, apathetic way to life are not good. They're both traps in for us in this perception of what life is in the world that we live in. So, I like to bring here the notion that in the book by Joanna de Angelis, it's a book that was written outside of the psychological series. It's called Empty Lives. And fun fact, it was Empty Lives, right? It was published the day before the World Health Organization declared the world under a state of emergency, or a state of pandemic in 2020, right? And Joanna, in that book, it's really good book, by the way, it really discusses this issue that is brought here in this chapter, subchapter of this book, Jesus in Our Days, as well as in the introduction of the book by Leon Denis. So here's a plug for both of those books, or the three books, by the way. So it's important for us to perhaps understand that without accepting that we have this spiritual essence, right? The soul that our body inhabits, right? This is something that will not allow us to be driven, right? Because we, the soul, our spirit, really is here with the goal to evolve spiritually, and to evolve in terms of in a particular sense, our own individuality. So if we don't have that awareness and understanding of even this spiritual essence, there is no real reason for us to want to be better, right? Why should I? I've been given some cards that is not what I want, and I joke a lot about it myself, right? I'm a very short person, and I say, oh, why am I so short? In my next life, I would like to be very tall and slender, a model, if you will. And as a joke as it is, but if I don't know anything, I either get upset with the notion that there is no after this life, but also I see all the people and they're so much taller than me, and this is again a joke, and I don't do anything about it, right? So it's good to think about it, right? And back to Leon Denis, he mentioned um, in the end of the introduction where he says the I'm sorry, I'm lying here. He mentions this later in the book, but he mentions that the gradual and progressive evolution, right? Our evolution, spiritual evolution, is the fundamental law of nature and the fundamental law of life. And he says, and I'm quoting here in the English translation of the book, if there is less joy on earth than suffering, It is because this is the instrument par excellence of education and progress, a stimulant for the being, which without it would be retarded in the ways of sensuality. Pain, physical and moral, shapes our experience, and wisdom is the prize. So, no apologies for suffering. He just says pain exists, and because notion of immortality of the soul, it is a mechanism for us to grow. So he goes on to say matter, material life, is the useful obstacle. It provokes the effort and develops the will. His book talks a lot about those effort and will, right? It contributes to the ascension, that notion of we are growing, right? The ascension of beings, imposing needs that oblige them to work. How, without pain, should we know joy? Without the shadow, enjoy the light. Without deprivation, savor the good acquired, the satisfaction achieved. And then he ends with here's the reason why we find difficulties of all sorts in us and around us. So, again, a plug for both books, Empty Lives by Joanna de Angelis, Life and Destiny by Leon Denis. But either way, right, when we hear those things, those thoughts, we start to think about it. Well, suffering, which is an indelible part of the discussion on torment, suffering relates to, right, to a condition, temporary, in the light of the immortality of the soul especially, but it's temporary condition that requires an intervention, a treatment, or something in order for us to reestablish our physical or mental spiritual well-being. And Joanna brings this topic to remind us that, yeah, suffering is part of that larger mechanism that is inherent in our spiritual growth as an immortal being living a material life, right? And she reminds us that in itself, suffering can be this trigger, right? It can be the source that pushes, that propels us to do something differently. And I even mentioned that to a conversation yesterday. I said, I'm so talking to somebody who was going through some issues. And I said, I'm so glad you're this uncomfortable because now you're going to do something about it. And she started to laugh. It's like, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. 20 years of my life has nothing to do with marital status. It has to do with other types of issues. Because of 20 years I've been doing this, and now I can see that I am uncomfortable enough to do something about it, right? So that pain, suffering, discomfort, whatever you want to call it, can be the trigger to push us to do something differently, right? In a more prosaic term, it can be the pebble inside our shoes that, ugh, right? What is it? What is it? Let me take it out at some point when it's hurting so that I can have an easier walk from then on. But suffering may lead us to also maturity, and it may lead to that broader view of what life really is. So as I mentioned in this slide here, generically speaking, human beings have been considered to be a still incomplete mental and physical mass heading for the grave where it decays. And what I want to bring here is the fact that Joanna is talking about if we fall into a material perspective of what we are and how we are. And if we only see life from that perspective, the material perspective, we we are tormented, we're suffering, and we're doing nothing about it, right? So it's with that I say that it remind you and myself here that there are those of us who live to enjoy life, and there are those of lies who deny any form of enjoyment. This is not what life is about. And there's those words from Joanna, right? There are, we can deal with pleasure and joy as part of our emotional landscape without falling prey to what caused them to begin with, right? So let's talk about something else that I love it, which is the notion of happiness. Yes, Joanna, in the previous chapter of Jesus in in our days, talks about that happiness is only possible for those who found truth. Very bold statement, right? And at the same time, when she's talking about happiness, she brings this notion that Jesus is the prototype of happiness. So we ask ourselves, okay, Jesus was the prototype of happiness. How so? Well, he loved nature, he loved people, and he loved the simple efforts that life was all about, as exemplified in his parables, right? The other component of Jesus' life and happiness is the fact that he never condemned or praised our current material condition on earth. He understood where each one of us are today and what we need to do to keep moving in our ascensional, in our progress, right? So no condemnation, and he was a teacher. He was our master, and as a teacher he taught us that yeah, we are on earth, yes, so let us leverage our earthly conditions to generate our happiness ourselves and in the future. Excuse me. So I put it in the slide, right? As a physician of souls, Jesus prescribed experiencing them, those earthly conditions, without becoming enslaved, and pointing to loftier goals to be reached through personal effort. And this is really, we could talk about another hour just about that sentence, because we often become enslaved to our current, what I call our ecosystem, right? Our conditions, our culture, our current material expression of our existence. So instead, I want to bring to you a reference to another book in the psychological series by Joanna de Angelis called The Conscious Being, because she brings this subject again, happiness. And she says in that book that happiness is not, and I say this really, capital letters, not the possibility of satisfying any whim of my ego, right? It's not. Because if I did that, I would actually feeding my existence with anxieties and discomfort. And if we go back to Leon Denis, when he was so frustrated with those human institutions, right? It's because you, education institution, you home, families, you have religions, you are still addressing ephemeral and temporary things instead of the essential permanent things, which is the immortality of the soul. And it's the same thing. Whenever we look for happiness in the demands of the ego, we are feeding the same. It's ephemeral, it is temporal, and it will fall apart, will lead to anxiety, so on and so forth. So Joanna continues in the book, The Conscious Being, that in our pursuit of happiness, there are indeed certain stages of suffering and pleasures, right? It's important, that are inevitable to go through. Why? They're simply part of our human experience. Specifically, they are part of how, very interesting, the self is realized, suffering and pleasures, right? How we realize ourself, and as we really focus on the real center of who we are, ourself, we start to no longer having to identify so heavily with our ego. Beautiful. So let's move on to our last component here, which is ooh, a big one, right? Guilt. Guilt. Human torments proceed from a guilty conscience. So I guess I could say that's the root cause for all of our suffering. And then Joanna talks a lot about guilt, including in an earlier chapter of this book, specifically in chapter 5, when she discussed about tolerance. There is a discussion on guilt itself. So earlier in this book, she talks about guilt, and I want to bring this up because it's so dense in meaning, right? She, in chapter 5, says that guilt is the disturbing shadow found in our personality. As such, guilt is responsible for diseases and all other types of suffering. So, what are we going to say? We're going to say here that guilt is simply found in the deep archives of our own individuality. It's my own, no one else, right? And within that, it is there that we find our afflictions, that as we're going through them, surface up in the form of purifying processes. Those purifying processes may be expressed or somatized as diseases, as illnesses, or any form of torment. Remember, definition dictionary: severe form of physical or mental suffering, right? A torment and other source of dissatisfactions in our lives. So it is important here, as we are coming close to an end, to note that at the same time that it create appropriate condition for right, that easier or harder life, a life is characterized by our socioeconomic, moral problems or conditions, or they may our life can be enriched with love, with resources that will support our own journey. So it is within the profound immortal soul that it the roots of the phenomenon that now sprout in our physical body is found. Okay, so from that perspective, we cannot close without talking about the idea of the immortality of the soul. And you're going to say, Marcia, you already talked about. Yes, it's embedded in this whole construct of a definition of torment is the notion of immortality of the soul. And I'd like to take a moment to read this rather poetic reference to torment, right? And Joanna in the book, she says, your current torments are torments you engendered in past lives. Guilt. You ruthless, I'm sorry, ruthlessly tormented others, and how you suffer without comfort, right? You're mercilessly afflicted others, and now you hurt without affection. You trouble others with perversity, and now you trouble yourself without consolation. Your inner being is a boiling cauldron. That guilt, that is the trigger, that is the torment, that is our own type of torture, right? So Joanna concludes simply by saying, okay, listen up. Conflicts follow conflicts. Yeah. I remember a discussion that she had earlier about Sisyphus, right? And so when you have a chance, read the myth of Sisyphus. But anyways, so and that explains that quite well. But she says conflicts follow conflicts, and if we don't do anything about them, we will certainly move to that state of desperation from one conflict to the next. That's Sisyphus. He avoided something, he got into a conflict. He avoided that conflict, he got into another, to a very interesting myth, right? And yes, this may be a very grim outcome, but it's important for us to understand, why does Joanna bring that up now, right? Well, she gave us two reasons for why we perpetuate our lives of torments. And it's very simple, but I'll bring it up to you here, is the fact that number one, it is hard. It is hard to exteriorize and talk about our inner conflicts. And what I mean by that is to talk about what is so painful, what I don't want to see because I repressed in my shadow, what is the things that is so hard for me to do, and because if I were to do it, I would get some relief, right? So think about, and the book Empty Lives actually brings that quite well, this notion that we live in a world of appearances, and we do everything to fit in, instead of doing everything to belong, right? So a good example, and it's easy enough to do this caricature, right? And I may be feeling terrible. I just had COVID. I don't feel very good. My nose is still stuffy. My whole being is not good, and yet I'm gonna take a selfie and I'm gonna look beautiful. I'm gonna put filters. I'm gonna apply everything to look as if I am feeling perfectly well. And we do this. We create in this society of appearances, um, a sense of this false construct of what is acceptable instead of what simply is, right? So that's number one. Number two, phobias, complexes, and repression are defense mechanisms that dominate our mental landscape. And we avoid, because it hurts, right? We avoid to confront the escape mechanism through self discovery, through truth, through all the mechanism, and we end up feeling like a failure, or the famous imposter syndrome, right? We pretend to be what we're not until we feel it catches up. So Joanna encourages us to retemper our souls. She says, leave the den of your torments for the clear light of reason. And of course, immediately I can think about the myth of Plato's cave. And I love, it's easy for you to read, just again, Google for it, and you have it very easily accessible, but it's the notion that one of the people in the cave leaves and has the clarity, and he comes back and says, no, this is so bad, and nobody leaves, right? Because it is easier said than done. It is easier to continue to live in the cave because that's how we know. But Joanna is like in the myth of the cave, coming to us says, folks, wake up. What we've been living is just an illusion, a projection into the cave. This is not reality. Let's get out. So Joanna counters this idea, this rather conformist in nature, to say, do one on this earth death to be no one, I'm sorry, not do. No one on this earth is destined for suffering or any type of destructive conflicts, right? So really important for us as we close to think about it. Back to Leon Denis, he tells us that the law of rebirth, reincarnation, explains and completes the principle of immortality. Well, we can go again to another discussion here because while immortality somehow leads to the idea of reincarnation, one does not mean the other. So he says, yeah, reincarnation explains and completes the notion of the immortality of the soul. And he says, we must see in the plurality of our lives the necessary condition of our own education and our own progress. And he continues by saying, it is the cost, at the cost of our own efforts. It is at the cost of our own struggles, our sufferings, that we are able to redeem ourselves from our state of either ignorance, immaturity, or any feelings of inferiority. So Joanna then wraps it up by completing and saying that we return to earth to learn, to recover, and to rebuild. I love it. Let's say it again. We return to earth to learn, to recover, and to rebuild. But, she says, in the absence of love, action, and this is something that we're going to talk more about it later on, but it's the idea of loving and in action, suffering appears in the effort to renew ourselves. So let's here take those words of consolation and pursue peace and release from all of our distresses, and life will be easier on us. But I have one last slide, which is this one about love, because it is truly an invitation that Joanna brings to us. It is to simply put, just love. And she finalizes the chapter by bringing to us the story of Mary Magdalene. And in the New Testament, we find it's an unforgettable account of when Jesus met the woman of loose morals, right? And you may remember because she comes in and she, washes Jesus's feet, and she uses ointment, but her tears, and she wipes his feet with her hair. And I love the scene, it's so dramatic. And Joanna calls this, well, this is the psychotherapy that Mary found for her torments, right? She was deeply repentant for her life, and she threw herself in the moment, and she changed the remaining of her life as an outcome. But the thing here is that Jesus was criticized, right, for not only welcoming the woman, but allowing her to wash his feet. And Jesus said to his host, right? And he said he knew he was criticizing mentally. And he said, she, the woman, has loved much. Consequently, her sins shall be forgiven. Looking at her with tenderness and affection, Jesus instructed, go in peace. Your faith has saved you. So Joanna reminds us that love that has been converted into reparation for anyone's wrongdoing, right? Yours, mine, anybody else, is actually the very effective remedy for all the sores that we bring. And may those sores be in my body, in my mind, or my soul. So let us end truly our discussion today with this invitation to love, to be at peace, and to leave our pain in the past. Let us rise from the rubbles. Let's resurface. Let's be happy and let's reconstruct our lives as such. I hope this discussion today has inspired you to begin each day with love and courage. And next week, chapter 16, we're going to talk about rest. Thank you so very much for being here with me, and goodbye.